Welcome back, everyone. Let's talk about pure and impure functions. When we talk about a pure function, there are mainly two things to consider. And the first one is very simple. You have a function. So here I'm going to initialize one. I'm going to call it pure func. And what this function does is it takes some arguments. In this particular case, let's imagine it takes two numbers. What a pure function should do is return the exact same thing no matter how many times it gets called when it's given the same arguments. So here our pure function is just a function that receives a and b, which are both integers, and it will add them together. That's what it returns. So here, for my function to be pure, if I give it 2 and 4, it should always give me 6. No matter how many times I call this function, this should always return 6. And looking at this function, you might think, oh, Yihua, that's super intuitive. Of course, because looking at the identity, this is a very simple function. But we all have seen functions that go way beyond and above this. And where are those conditions where this may not be pure? One easy example to think of is if we created some other function, let's call it func a. And this function, similar, has a and b, which are both integers. But what it does is it relies on some external value c. And let's say c right now is 3. And what it does is it returns you a plus b plus c. In this particular case, when you look at this new func a, if you were to pass this 2 and 4, you would get 9, because 2 plus 4 plus 3 is 9. This currently does give us back 9 every time we call it, but C might change. And if C changes, this is now no longer giving us the same value as it did previously. It's now giving us back 11 instead of 9. So this is an impure function. An important thing to note, C may change without func A knowing. And that's a very important thing. A function is considered pure when everything that dictates what it returns is completely isolated from what gets passed into it. This is very important because this function's return should solely be dependent on the props being passed in. That is the only way that your function is considered pure. Another thing that your function should not do in order for it to be considered a pure function is produce side effects. What is a side effect? Let's once again talk about that variable that we had before, c. C is some value that is outside of our function. In fact, we can make a new function. Let's call it func b. If this function takes a and b, but for some reason what it does is it sets c equal to a plus b, and what else it does is maybe it returns a times b. Func b, at this point, if you were to pass it 2 and 4, this will definitely always give you the same result. That validates what we said about pure functions. However, c is now being changed outside of the function. This is considered a side effect. A side effect is when a function creates some kind of effect outside of its scope. And in this particular case, it's setting some variable outside of the scope of its function. And the scope is whatever is inside of this function. The variable c does not live within the scope of this function. It's accessible within the scope of this function, but it is also accessible outside of the scope of this function. And as a result, if it were to change that variable, that is considered a side effect. These are very important things to note about pure functions and impure functions. So in summary, remember, a pure function, if it is to modify or rely on something outside of its scope and beyond the parameters being passed into it, that is an impure function. Now, when it comes to pure and impure functions, is one superior over the other? This is a highly contentious topic. Technically speaking, many JavaScript developers prefer writing code in a functional way because it's very predictable. You can look at a function, looking at its arguments, and understand what its output is going to be. This gives you a contract that is very secure. You can trust that this function is going to return what you expect it to return because it does not rely on something outside of the arguments being passed in. However, that does not necessarily mean that impure functions do not have a place. And this is an important thing to note because in React, what we are writing is going to be impure functions. We're going to use hooks to create impure functions. We have pure functions and we also have impure functions, but when you think about some of these hooks, understand that what you're doing is you are generating side effects. And that is really the idea around why pure and impure functions is an important thing to note. Because generally speaking, we want to write our functions purely. But when you write functional components, you will create impure functions. And by understanding that idea of modifying or relying on some value that exists outside of the scope of your function will help you understand the way that functional components render and re-render in React. So now that we understand this, let's move on to our next video.